Good evening. Settle in. Somewhere the light has already gone out of the sky, and somewhere else it is only beginning to turn that deep and patient blue at the edges, and either way there is nothing you are required to do for the next several hours except breathe slowly and let a very old story come to you. There was a company that opened its doors 355 years ago and closed them for the last time in the summer of just 1 year past. Sit with that number for a moment, gently, the way you might hold a smooth stone in your palm. 355 years is not a long life for a business. It is an impossible one. Businesses do not last 3.5 centuries. Neither, most of the time, do royal houses. When this company was founded, Isaac Newton was 27 years old and had not yet written down the laws that would rearrange the sky. The company was already 106 years old on the day the American colonies declared themselves free of the king who had signed its charter. It kept its accounts through the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, through the muskets of the American Revolution and the cannon of Napoleon, through the American Civil War, through 2 world wars fought with machines its founders could not have dreamed, and on into an age of glass screens and instant messages. And then, in March of the year 2025, it walked into a Canadian courtroom and asked for protection from its creditors. By July, the last of its stores had gone dark. One of the longest institutional lives in the history of commerce simply stopped breathing. But it was never only a business. At the height of its reach, in the last decades of the 1700s and the first decades of the 1800s, it was the working government of a country larger than all of Western Europe, a private trading concern answerable to shareholders in London, administering 1.5 million square miles of the North American interior through nothing more than a scattering of wooden posts along cold rivers and a slender hierarchy of fur trade officers who were also, as circumstance demanded, lawmakers and magistrates and constables and ambassadors. For long stretches it held more of the continent than any colonial government did. It drew the shape of what would one day be Canada more decisively than any parliament. It paid the wages of the men who first mapped the interior. Its posts became villages, and its villages became cities that hum with traffic tonight. It sat down across the fire from indigenous nations spread over a territory so vast that even the men who drafted its charter could not say with certainty where its borders lay. And then, in 1869, it sold that territory, sold, in effect, a continent to the young Confederated Government of Canada for £300,000, something near $1.5 million, a transaction that is still described, when measured by sheer surface of Earth, as the largest real estate deal ever made. The consequences of that sale have not finished arriving. They are still being argued in Canadian courtrooms and legislatures this very evening, while you lie there in the warm dark. The story of this company is the story of the North American fur trade, which is to say, it is the story of a hat. That may seem an unlikely foundation on which to build a civilization, a hat, and yet that is exactly where the foundation lies, down beneath everything else, waiting. It is the story of 2 Frenchmen who fell out with the authorities in New France and carried their grievance and their brilliant idea across an ocean to the King of England, setting in motion a chain of consequences that neither of them lived long enough to see finished. It is the story of the peoples of the subarctic, the Cree, the Dene, the Ojibwe, the Assiniboine, and many more, whose knowledge and labour and long-standing trade routes were the actual engine of the enterprise, and without whom the whole scheme would have failed inside a decade. Their relationship with the company was, all at once, a genuine partnership, a cultural upheaval, and a slow catastrophe from which those communities are still working to recover. And it is the story of the Métis, a new nation born from the marriages of European traders and indigenous women, a people who were sold along with the land in 1869 without ever being asked, and who answered that silence with a clarity and a courage that produced one of the defining moments in the history of their country. Tonight, we are going to tell all of it, slowly, from the beginning. There is a detail worth carrying with you as we go, a small one, the kind that catches the light oddly. The company took as its motto 3 Latin words, pro pelle cutem, skin for skin. It appears on the coat of arms alongside 4 beavers and a fox, and nobody now is entirely sure what the founders meant by it. Some historians read it as a merchant's shrug, a skin traded for a skin, fur for leather, an honest exchange. Others hear something older in it, a phrase lifted from the book of Job, where a man's skin is what he will give for his life. Historians still debate which meaning the gentlemen of London intended, or whether they thought about it very hard at all. The ambiguity has outlived every one of them, so let the lamp go low. Let the rooms soften around its edges. There are fires in this story too, small ones, banked in stone hearths inside log walls, burning through winters that would have killed every European in the room had they not been taught, patiently and repeatedly, by people who had been surviving those same winters for 10,000 years. You have nowhere to be. Let us go back to the animal at the bottom of it all, and to the strange question of why a creature living in a frozen river system should have mattered so enormously to a civilization on the far side of an ocean, a civilization that no one along that river had ever seen. To understand any of what follows, you first have to understand the hat. Picture it, broad-brimmed, deep-crowned, dense as a plank and soft as ash to the touch. From roughly 1550 until roughly 1850, 3 centuries, an unbroken span, no man of any standing in Europe walked out of doors bareheaded, and no hat was worth owning that was not made of beaver felt. This was not a whim of fashion clinging stubbornly to an arbitrary material. Beaver felt could do things nothing else available could do. Its fibres locked together under heat and pressure into a fabric that was dense and springy at once, willing to be shaped and blocked into whatever elaborate silhouette the decade demanded, and willing to hold that shape afterward. The oils in the animal's underfur made it shed rain without any treatment at all. It accepted dye evenly, so a hatter could promise a gentleman a black that was truly black across the whole brim. A well-made beaver hat could be worn for a lifetime and passed on afterward. The cheaper felts, rabbit, wool, the fur of lesser animals, went limp in the first heavy shower, lost their crown within a season, and announced to every passer-by that their owner had not been able to afford the real thing. In a world that read status off a man's silhouette at 40 paces, that was not a small thing. The difficulty was the animal itself. By the close of the 1500s, the European beaver was very nearly gone. It had once lived in the rivers of Britain and France, in the German waterways and the long, cold streams of Scandinavia, and it had been hunted out of nearly all of them by exactly the appetite that was now, at that very moment, reaching its height. The hat had arrived at the summit of its dominance in the same decades that the supply beneath it collapsed. Russia and the northern reaches of Scandinavia still held populations, and Russian furs kept European hatters working for a while, but those animals were under the same pressure, and prices climbed, and the climb had begun to threaten the hat's future, even among the men who had always been able to buy one. And then the reports began arriving from across the Atlantic. Jacques Cartier, sailing up the great river of the St. Lawrence in the 1530s, met people already wearing beaver robes, people who had been trading beaver among themselves and with distant neighbours, along routes centuries old, long before any European rode into view. The North American beaver was a different animal from its European cousin, a separate species, but its fur was every bit as fine and often finer, and it was present in numbers that the first Europeans to see them found difficult to describe without sounding as though they were lying. The rivers and lakes that drain toward Hudson Bay cover close to 4 million square kilometres, and across that whole immense basin, the beaver had not merely lived, it had built dams and lodges and terraced ponds, generation upon generation, engineering the water itself across a landscape for thousands of years, in densities so great that the earliest trappers found them within a short walk of any shoreline, unhurried, unafraid, having no inherited memory of the organised and relentless hunting that had emptied the rivers of Europe. Then there is the small, strange detail of what the hatters actually wanted, which turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. They did not want fresh fur. The felt maker's craft depended on the dense, curling underfur that lies beneath the long, stiff guard hairs, and those guard hairs had to be removed before anything could be done. There was a way to remove them that cost nothing at all: wearing the pelt. An indigenous family that had used a beaver robe as bedding and outer clothing through a winter or two, sleeping under it, walking in it, living an ordinary life in it, had, entirely incidentally, without any thought of European hat shops, produced precisely the material those shops most desired. The traders called it castor gras, the greasy beaver, and paid a premium for it. Fur taken freshly from the animal, castor sec, the dry beaver, was worth less, demanded more labour, and yielded a slightly poorer felt, which produced a commercial arrangement with a peculiar and rather beautiful logic at its centre. People doing nothing more than what they had always done, keeping warm in the way their grandparents had kept warm, were generating a product more valuable to European markets than the most diligent European trapper could produce by trying. The worn robe was the finer good. For a time, in the early years, before the sheer scale and momentum of the trade began to warp everything it touched, that made the exchange genuinely and concretely mutual in a way that colonial commerce very rarely was. Hold on to the hat. It will end this story as surely as it began it. Because 3 centuries is a long reign, but it is not forever. And in the 1830s and 1840s, silk hats appeared. Cheaper to make, indifferent to the fate of any animal, glossy in a way that suddenly looked modern. European gentlemen changed their minds about what to put on their heads. And that change of mind, that quiet drift of taste in London drawing rooms, did what no navy and no rival merchant had ever managed to do. It knocked the foundation out from under a monopoly that had held a continent. Somewhere between 50 and 100 million beaver were taken out of North America across 2 centuries because of the shape of a brim, and the political map of a continent was drawn around the traffic. There are few clearer demonstrations in all of commercial history that enormous things can turn on very small hinges. The human beginning of the thing is one of the least likely founding stories in the history of business, and it does not begin in England at all. It begins along the St. Lawrence, in New France, with 2 men whose careers were near-perfect specimens of the border-crossing, flag-changing, consequence-ignoring opportunism that the colonial fur trade seemed almost designed to attract. Médard Chouart de Groseilliers was born in France around 1618 and crossed to New France as a young man. He worked first among the Jesuit missions in the Great Lakes country, before drifting, as so many did, into the fur trade proper. By the 1650s, he was a seasoned woodland traveller, at ease in Algonquian languages, at ease in a canoe for weeks at a stretch, thoroughly familiar with the indigenous trade networks that carried pelts from the deep interior down to the counting houses of Montreal and Quebec. In 1658 or 59, he set out on a long journey westward with his much younger brother-in-law, Pierre-Esprit Radisson, pushing beyond Lake Superior into country of which the colonial administration held only the haziest notion. What they found there was beaver in quantities that made the St. Lawrence trade look like a village market. But the far more valuable discovery was not a thing they could carry home in a canoe. It was an idea about water. What the 2 men understood, partly from their own eyes, partly and probably mostly from the Cree they were trading with, was that the rivers of that vast interior do not run south, they run north. The lakes and streams of the subarctic tip their drainage away from the St. Lawrence entirely and pour into a great inland sea at the top of the continent. And that sea could be entered by ship, directly, from England, from France, sailing in over open salt water without ever passing a single French customs officer. Turn that over slowly, the way they must have. If a ship could sail into Hudson Bay, then a merchant could trade face-to-face with the peoples of the interior, and every intermediary between the fur and the London market simply evaporated. The Montreal houses, the licensing officials, the colonial governors cut, the long chain of canoe middlemen. The saving in freight alone would have been transformative. The strategic implication was larger still, though neither man was in a position to profit from it. England could plant itself in the very heart of North America without firing a shot at the French settlements guarding the river mouth. They came home in 1660 at the head of a flotilla of 60 canoes riding low in the water with fur. It was an arrival of such obvious significance that the governor of New France ordered the guns of the citadel at Quebec fired in salute. cannon smoke over the river and cheering, and the recognition of a genuine commercial triumph. And then the colonial administration seized their furs and fined them for trading without a license. There are moments in history when the small-mindedness of an official meets the achievement of an individual and produces a result that the official could not have imagined and would have been horrified to foresee. This is one of the purest examples ever recorded. Groseilliers and Radisson were not men who absorbed an insult quietly. They appealed to the court in Paris, and Paris did not trouble itself to answer. They travelled to Boston, where the New England merchants were courteous and interested and unwilling to risk enough money. Crossing the Atlantic, they were taken by Dutch privateers. They arrived at last in England in 1665, the year the plague was emptying London street by street, and somehow, in a city burying its dead, they worked their way into the orbit of the restored court of Charles II, and eventually into a room with Prince Rupert. Rupert was the king's cousin, German-born, a professional soldier since boyhood, an occasional admiral, a man of restless and speculative appetite, who was among the more genuinely enterprising investors around the throne. He grasped the proposition immediately. He assembled a syndicate, secured the interest of the king himself, and fitted out 2 ships to test whether the Frenchmen were describing a real sea or a beautiful fantasy. The ships were called the Eaglet and the Nonsuch. They were small, underpowered, and old. Contemporary accounts reach without hesitation for the word decrepit. The Eaglet, with Radisson aboard, was beaten back by storms somewhere in the grey water between Ireland and Newfoundland, and never crossed at all. The Nonsuch, with Groseilliers, kept going. Her captain was Zachariah Gillam out of Boston, and he kept a log with the kind of unhurried attention that preserves a voyage rather than merely recording it. Through his pages you can still see what those waters looked like to men seeing them for the first time. The mountains of ice standing off the bow, the white bears moving along the shore islands, the enormous desolate beauty of a subarctic coast in late summer when the light does not properly leave the sky. The Nonsuch came into James Bay at the southern foot of that great inland sea in September of 1668. Groseilliers and Gillam made contact with Cree people along the shore, opened the season's trade, and settled in to winter over in conditions the Europeans among them found close to unbearable. In the spring they sailed for home with a cargo of furs sufficient to prove that every word of the proposition had been true. Charles II signed the Royal Charter on the 2nd of May, 1670. That would be a tidy place to leave the 2 Frenchmen, but neither of them was finished being extraordinary. And what happened to them afterward is worth following, because in miniature it is the whole Atlantic colonial world. Groseilliers, the elder and the less suited by temperament to the political manoeuvring that came after the Charter, withdrew from the company's active affairs before long. He went back to New France in 1674, made his peace with the same colonial authorities who had once confiscated his furs, and lived out his remaining years in the country where he had begun. Nobody wrote down the date of his death. It has been lost as completely as the smoke from those celebratory cannon. Radisson's later life was considerably less peaceful. He sailed to Hudson Bay for the English company in the early 1670s, helping raise the first posts and make the connections on which the trade would depend. Then, in 1674, he too returned to French service, apparently at the invitation of French agents who had worked out that a man carrying his particular knowledge of that bay was now a strategic asset. He served France for several years, and in 1682 he led a French expedition to the Nelson River at the southwestern corner of the bay, establishing a French presence in direct defiance of the monopoly he had helped create. He took an English ship and her furs, and then the French colonial authorities, quarrelling over the division of the proceeds, cheated him of his share. At which point Radisson did something that was either a masterwork of opportunism or an honest expression of where his loyalty had settled, and was very likely both. He went back to the English. He sailed to London in 1684, negotiated a pension and a post from the company committee, sailed once more to Hudson Bay, and took from the French the very fort he had planted there 2 years earlier, taking it, as it happened, from his own nephew, the son of Groseilliers, who held the command. He spent the rest of his working life in the company's employ, made several more crossings to the bay, and died in London around 1710 at roughly 70 years of age. A man who had served France, then England, then France, then England again, with a flexibility entirely native to the world he had lived in, a world in which national loyalty was real enough and competed all day long with professional survival and personal advantage. That is the shape of the whole colonial Atlantic in 2 lives. Men who knew things governments needed to know, who could do things governments needed done, and who rented that knowledge to whichever authority would meet the price, changing sides when the price changed. What they left behind was not the national interest either of them claimed at any particular moment. It was the structure, the company, the sea route, the relationship with the Cree along the shore. Those outlived every allegiance and every man who ever swore one. The document the king put his name to on that 2nd day of May is among the most extravagant transfers of power ever written into English law, and it is worth walking through it slowly, because almost everything that follows for the next 2 centuries is folded up inside its clauses, like a map inside a pocket. The enterprise it created was called, in full, the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. The word adventurers carried none of its modern flavour of thrill-seeking. In the 17th century, an adventurer was simply a person who ventured capital, who put money at risk in a scheme that might not come home. These were investors. The romance was accidental. The charter granted them the sole right to trade in every land watered by every river that emptied into Hudson Bay. But it did not stop at trade. It gave them the right to make laws, to hold courts, to judge, to punish, to wage war and to conclude peace with peoples the document called non-Christian. It handed a group of London gentlemen what amounted to sovereign authority over a territory whose extent the charter did not specify, because nobody involved had any idea what that extent was. The country it described came to be called Rupert's Land, after the prince who had championed the venture and who became the company's first governor. At its fullest reach, it covered something on the order of 3,900,000 square kilometres, larger than the whole of Western Europe. It took in what are now Manitoba, most of Saskatchewan, the southern reaches of Alberta, part of Nunavut, and great swathes of Ontario and Quebec, and it spilled south across a line that did not yet exist into the future states of Minnesota and North Dakota. The definition given, all the lands whose waters run to the bay, was precise enough that a surveyor could eventually trace it. It was also a definition whose authors could not possibly have known that it enclosed close to 2/5 of the modern landmass of Canada. They signed it in a room in London and went home to dinner. 18 investors held the original shares, each entitled to a portion of the profits in proportion to what they had risked. Rupert held the largest. The structure was what we would now call a joint stock company, and in 1670 that was still a fairly new invention. The East India Company had worked out the form a few decades earlier, and the adventurers modelled themselves on it deliberately and openly. The innovation was quiet but enormous. Investors could share in a great enterprise without being personally ruined by its debts, and no single one of them had to carry the whole risk alone. That mechanism is what made ventures of this scale thinkable at all. And the fact that this particular venture then survived for 3.5 centuries says at least as much about the durability of the idea as about the talents of any of the men who ran it. Now set the parchment down, because the country the charter described was not an empty room awaiting furniture. It had been inhabited for 8,000 to 10,000 years, since the ice pulled back from the subarctic at the end of the last glaciation, by peoples whose command of that specific and unforgiving environment was so complete, so thoroughly absorbed into daily life, that Europeans arriving on the shore of the bay simply could not see it. What they saw was wilderness. What they meant by wilderness was the absence of the particular signs their own civilization used to prove that human beings were present. Walled towns, ploughed fields, stone buildings, roads, written deeds. None of those things were there. What was there instead was a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, organized not around holding still and farming, but around moving intelligently through a cold ecosystem whose rhythms, the ice out, the goose flights, the caribou roads, the fish runs, the years the hares crash and the years they return, had been read, remembered, and managed for 100 centuries. The Cree who lived along the southern shores of Hudson Bay and James Bay, the people the Nonsuch crew met in that first winter of 1668, became the company's principal partners in its early generations, and the relationship they built with it is among the most consequential indigenous European commercial relationships anywhere on the continent. They were experienced traders long before an English sail appeared on the horizon. Cree people had been participants in networks running from the Arctic coast to the Great Lakes for centuries, and they understood exchange as a mature institution, the setting of rates, the reading of supply and scarcity, the cultivation of a trading partner as a social and political relationship, and not merely a transaction. European observers consistently underestimated this and consistently paid for the mistake at the counter. The Cree brought beaver to the posts the company built along the bay. The company brought manufactured goods that the Cree found genuinely useful and genuinely desirable. And it is worth being exact here, because the mythology on this point is thick and unhelpful. Iron tools and iron weapons held an edge that stone could not hold. Woolen cloth was warm and stayed warm, and it could be cut and sewn in ways other materials could not. Copper kettles were lighter than clay, did not shatter when dropped, could sit directly in the fire, and lasted for years. And firearms transformed both hunting and warfare for whoever held them, relative to whoever did not. That last item is the one whose consequences ran fastest and furthest. The uneven distribution of guns, flowing outward from the posts along the paths of trade, reaching some peoples early and others late and others not at all, altered the balance of power among indigenous nations across the interior of North America. Peoples cut off from direct European contact sought access through intermediaries, or bargained for it, or were pressed westward by neighbours who were better armed than they were. Whole populations moved. Political arrangements that had held for generations were rebuilt. The social geography of the middle of a continent was quietly redrawn from the shore of a single bay, and the full consequences took generations to become visible, even to the people living through them. It is worth pausing on one small, well-known object at the centre of all this exchange, because it will keep appearing until the very last page of the story. The trade blanket. Heavy wool, woven in England, marked along one edge with short black lines, the points, indicating its size and the number of beaver it was worth. The lines were not decoration. They were a measurement you could read at a glance across a counter, in any language, in poor light, without a common word between buyer and seller. Practical, humble, and destined to become a national emblem. And here too is one of the enduring puzzles of the whole enterprise. The company's own account books are among the most complete commercial records surviving from the early modern world. An unbroken run of ledgers, post-journals, and correspondence stretching across centuries, now held in Winnipeg and consulted by climate scientists, who use the factor's daily weather notes to reconstruct the temperature of the 17th century Arctic. And yet historians still argue about what those ledgers actually prove. Some read them and find a trade in which indigenous negotiators consistently drove hard bargains and extracted better terms than London ever intended. Others read the same columns and find the slow tightening of dependence. The numbers are the same. The story people take from them is not. The company's opening strategy, the one it held to for a very long time, earned it a nickname from its rivals that has never quite worn off. They said it was sleeping by the frozen sea. The description was fair. The company built its posts on the shore of the bay itself and waited. It did not go inland. It let the rivers bring the furs down to it. York Factory, raised in the 1680s on the western shore at the mouth of the Hayes River, became the principal establishment, the landing place for the annual ship from England, the warehouse for the trade goods it carried, and the depot where the winter's furs were baled for the return voyage. Moose Factory, Fort Albany, and a handful of smaller posts around James Bay made up the rest. The model was simplicity itself. Keep the posts standing, stock them each summer from the ship. rely on the indigenous trading networks that already existed and had existed for centuries to deliver the goods. The criticism that this was passive, that the company was living off other people's knowledge and other people's labour and other people's canoes while claiming a territory it had never walked across, was accurate as description and beside the point as strategy. The alternative was what the French had been doing for decades: the coureurs de bois, the unlicensed woods runners who paddled the interior rivers, wintered in the villages, learned the languages, married into the communities, and formed a living intelligence network for New France. That system worked beautifully, and it was ruinously expensive, nearly impossible to control from a desk, and demanded an enormous supporting apparatus of provisions and canoes and men. The coastal model cost less, could be managed from a room in London, and required none of the physical and linguistic skills that travelling the interior demanded, and for a long while it was entirely sufficient. The furs came. There was no commercial reason on earth to go and fetch what was already arriving at the door. So the company held that shape from 1670 until 1774, a full century of essentially unchanged strategy, broken only by a handful of expeditions launched partly from curiosity and partly because the charter had obliged them to go looking for something else entirely. 104 years is a long time to do the same thing. It tells you something about the stability of the arrangement and something rather less flattering about the London committee that governed it. Men who had never seen the country they ruled, whose entire understanding of the subarctic came from the annual bundle of reports and from the occasional conversation with a returning factor or a visiting indigenous traveller, and who had no mechanism at all for acquiring the kind of direct knowledge that might have made them restless. It was not laziness exactly, it was the natural condition of governing at a distance of 3,000 miles and 11 months. The something else the charter had obliged them to look for was a passage through the ice. The Northwest Passage, a sea road running from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the top of the world, threading the Arctic islands above North America, was one of the long obsessions of European seafaring. If it existed and could be sailed, it would collapse the terrible distances of global commerce, erasing the months-long agonies of rounding the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn. Monarchs and merchants had been funding attempts on it since the 1500s, and would go on funding them, with a persistence that begins to look less like commerce and more like faith. Henry Hudson's voyage of 1610 was one of those attempts. He sailed into the bay that now carries his name, believing it might be the passage itself, wintered in its southern reach, and in the spring of 1611 was put over the side in a small boat by his mutinous crew, along with his son and a few loyal men, and left there. He was never seen again. He died somewhere on that great inland sea, whose commercial future his own voyage had made possible. And there is no grave, and no one knows the day. The charter written 6 decades later named the search for the passage as one of the company's duties, partly because a navigable passage would have been worth an unimaginable sum, and partly because a monopoly of that magnitude required a public justification more elevated than pure profit. Something for the nation, something for knowledge. The company did send expeditions. James Knight, the same factor whose name will return in a moment for a very different reason, organised one in 1719 to look for the passage along the northern shore of the bay. Knight was about 70 years old when he sailed, an age at which most men in that trade had long since gone home to a warm room in Orkney or London. His reasons were a mixture of real geographical curiosity and the reports he had been collecting for years from indigenous traders, of copper in the northern country and of other riches beyond the copper. He did not come back. His ships were wrecked on Marble Island, off the northwest coast of the bay, a low, pale granite place that looks from a distance like ice and never becomes anything warmer. The whole expedition, some 40 men, died there over the following months, almost certainly of scurvy and exposure and the simple arithmetic of a winter with no way out. Nothing was known of their fate for 50 years, until a later expedition found the remains. But Inuit oral tradition had kept the memory the entire time, carried in speech across 2 generations without a written word. the last two survivors, seen by Inuit observers, moving on their hands and knees along the shore in the final stages of starvation, looking out at a sea that would not open. The company's most consequential journey of that era was made overland and made possible by a partnership. Samuel Hearne tried 3 times between 1769 and 1772 to walk from Hudson Bay to the Arctic Ocean. His first 2 attempts failed, largely because he set out without adequate indigenous guidance into a country for which every European assumption he carried was precisely wrong. His 3rd attempt succeeded, and it succeeded because of Matonabbee, the Chippewayan leader who guided him, one of the most important figures in the company's entire history, and a man who understood something Hearne had not: that a party travelling that country without women in it would fail, because the work of survival on the march was distributed and specialised, and could not be done by men alone. With Matonabbee guiding and a large party of Chippewayan and Cree travelling with him, Hearne reached the Coppermine River and followed it down to its mouth on the Arctic Ocean in July of 1771. The journey settled several questions at once. There was no navigable passage anywhere in the latitudes the company cared about. The copper the reports had promised was not a mountain of wealth, but a modest outcrop of limited commercial worth. And the interior of the subarctic was vastly larger and vastly more intricate than any map in the company's possession had allowed. That expedition also witnessed a killing at a place on the river called Bloody Falls, where Matonabbee's Chippewayan companions came upon a camp of copper Inuit and attacked it, and some 20 people died, men, women, and children. Hearne could not prevent it, and did not pretend afterward that he had tried very hard, and he wrote it down in his journal in detail, with an anguish that has troubled every reader since. Historians have argued for 2 centuries about that passage, whether it is an honest witness's account of something he could not stop, or a later literary construction shaped for a London audience, or something uneasily between the 2. What is not in doubt is that it happened, and that Hearne was a company man, and Matonabbee a company ally, and that here the human cost of the commercial web the company had spun across that country became briefly and terribly visible in one place on one afternoon. The first serious threat to the company's existence, though, came not from the ice and not from a competitor's ledger. It came from soldiers. France and England spent the closing decades of the 1600s in a slow, complicated, continent-wide contest for North America, and the arrival of an English trading presence at the top of the map was not something New France could shrug at. If the adventurers consolidated their hold on the bay, England would effectively command the entire northern half of the continent, reaching around behind the French settlements without ever having to fight through them. So in March of 1686, the French sent an overland expedition under the Chevalier de Troyes out of Montreal. More than 1,000 kilometres through the winter bush on snowshoes, then by canoe through the chaos of the spring breakup, hauling powder and shot over ice that was already rotting underfoot. As a feat of movement, it belongs among the great marches of the period, and it is barely remembered outside Canada. Second in command was Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, the most formidable soldier New France ever produced, and the man who would become this company's greatest adversary. They came out at James Bay in late May, and within a few weeks every English post on the southern shore had fallen. Moose Factory, Rupert House, Fort Albany. The small garrisons had no realistic chance against that combination of speed, tactical intelligence, and d'Iberville's personal willingness to be the first man over the wall. The goods, the stored furs, the cannon, all taken. The English prisoners were carried out to Charlton Island to wait for their own supply ship to come and find them. What d'Iberville did afterward reads like invention, and is not. He took York Factory in 1694 and held it a year before English forces recovered it. Then he came back in 1697 for the most extraordinary episode of an extraordinary life. Commanding a French squadron sent to settle the question of York Factory permanently, he found himself alone in the bay, his supporting ships separated in the ice, facing 3 Royal Navy warships, any one of which should have been more than enough to finish him. In a running fight through ice-choked water, with a damaged hull and a reduced crew, he sank one, captured another, and drove off the third. Then he turned and took York Factory by siege. It is called the Battle of Hudson's Bay, and it remains the largest naval engagement ever fought in the North American Arctic, a sea fight conducted among floes at the top of the world over the ownership of a warehouse full of beaver pelts. The posts changed hands over and over through the 1690s and into the new century, taken, retaken, taken again, in a slow, expensive seesaw that settled nothing and cost both sides more than either could easily justify. There were years when the company's survival was a genuinely open question, when the London Committee met to consider whether there was anything left to govern. What ended it was not a battle, it was a table in a Dutch city. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which closed the War of the Spanish Succession, included among its long catalogue of provisions the restoration of Hudson Bay and all its posts to England. France, taking compensation elsewhere, let go of its claim to the subarctic trade. The company had its posts back, its monopoly confirmed, and ahead of it a long stretch of commercial calm that would hold until the 1780s, when the next threat arrived, not from Paris, but from Montreal. York Factory, once it was English again, became one of the strangest establishments ever raised on the North American continent. Warehouse, government office, hospital, victualling depot, and administrative capital of the largest private landholding on Earth, all of it packed into a huddle of wooden buildings standing on a tidal flat at the edge of the subarctic. The word factory, which sounds industrial now, had nothing to do with manufacturing. It came from the title of the man in charge, the factor, and simply meant the place where the factor sat. There were no machines in it. There was a counter, a fur loft, a powder magazine, a kitchen, a chapel of sorts, and a great deal of weather. It was built on permafrost, which meant every wall stood on ground that froze solid all winter and gave way slightly every summer, so that keeping the buildings upright was a continuous act of carpentry folded into the working day alongside everything else. The land around it was soaked through in the warm months, muskeg and standing water, and the men laid boardwalks between the buildings to keep from sinking past their knees on the way to the storehouse. In winter the temperature dropped past 40 below with regularity, and the wind came off the bay and added something to that number that the factors described in their reports to London with a precision suggesting they very much wanted the committee to understand what was being asked of the men in their employ. Ink froze. Nails split wood. The mercury sank into the bulb and stayed there. The men who staffed the posts in those decades came, overwhelmingly, from the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland. That was partly geography. The annual supply ship called at Stromness on the way out and again on the way home, so Orkney was simply the last place to take on hands, and partly a deliberate judgment about which men lasted. Orcadians knew cold. They knew small boats in rough northern water. They knew a life arranged entirely around weather and isolation, because that was the life they came from. And the company found, too, that they were more inclined than mainland men to sign on for a second season and a third, rather than bolting at the first sight of a homeward sail. They were essential, and they knew it. And the surviving letters occasionally catch them using that knowledge to press the London Committee for better terms, in a tone the committee evidently found trying. The whole commercial system of the subarctic turned on a single annual rhythm, and it began with the sound of ice breaking. Each spring, as the Hayes River shattered and the inland waterways opened, the trading parties who had spent the winter out on the land began to converge on the bay. They came from hundreds of miles inland, from the Churchill, from the Saskatchewan, from the Assiniboine country, canoes riding heavy with the winter's furs, arriving over a period of weeks. The factor presided over their coming with a mixture of commercial calculation and diplomatic care, because he understood, even when London did not, what the occasion actually was. The ceremonies that preceded trade were not formalities to be hurried past on the way to business. They were the business. The smoking of pipes, the giving of gifts, the speeches of welcome and the speeches of reply, formal and unhurried, sometimes lasting the better part of a day. the negotiation of prices conducted in terms that had barely changed in decades, and that both sides understood as the yearly renewal of an alliance, not merely the pricing of a commodity. A factor who tried to skip the pipe and get to the ledger was not being efficient, he was being insulting, and the furs would go elsewhere. Before we come to how those prices were actually reckoned, one life from these early years deserves to be sat with properly, because it was brief, and it changed everything, and it belongs to a young woman whose name appears on almost no monuments. Thanadeltha was born around 1697 in what is now northern Manitoba. She was Chipewyan, Dean, and in 1713 she was taken captive in a Cree raid, one young woman swept up in the intermittent warfare between Cree and Chipewyan that the uneven distribution of European guns had sharpened into something far more lethal than it had been. She escaped the following year and made her way, mostly alone and in a condition close to death, to the English post at York Factory. James Knight, the factor there, understood within days that something remarkable had walked in out of the snow. The Chipewyan held vast country to the northwest of the bay, rich in beaver and in marten and in fox, and they had not been drawn into the English trade at all, because they were at war with the Cree who controlled the southern approaches, and that war stood between them and the post like a wall. Thanadeltha offered to take it down. She would go north and west with a company expedition. She would interpret. She would broker a peace between two peoples who had been killing one another and open the road. What followed is one of the great diplomatic achievements in the history of the fur trade, and it very nearly killed her, twice. The expedition she led north from York Factory in 1715 was brutal beyond ordinary description. A winter journey on foot and snowshoe through country that killed several of the party outright and brought the rest to the edge of collapse. When they finally reached a Chipewyan camp, they found the people there hostile, unwilling to talk, recent killings still raw among them. At which point Thanadeltha simply took the entire situation into her own hands. She walked into the camp alone. She spoke to her own people, argued with them, by every surviving account, at length and at volume, until her voice gave out. She persuaded them to come. She arranged the meeting between Cree and Chipewyan leaders, and she presided over the peace ceremony herself, with an authority and composure that Knight, reading the reports when the party came home, wrote about in his journal with an admiration that reads as almost disbelieving. She had accomplished in a matter of days what the company had been hoping for over years. She died of illness at York Factory in 1717, at roughly 20 years of age. Knight recorded her death with a grief that makes no attempt to separate the professional loss from the personal one. Without her, the peace she made might not have held. With her, the Chipewyan entered the trade and became among the most important partners in the company's expansion north. The unit of account in this world was the made beaver, one prime pelt of an agreed quality, against which every other thing in the storehouse was priced. A pound of tobacco stood at 1 made beaver, a blanket at 7, a gun at 14. The company printed standard tariffs that were supposed to govern every transaction everywhere, and the actual bargaining at the counter departed from those tariffs constantly, in ways the factors reported to London with varying degrees of candour. The made beaver was never a physical object passing across the counter. It was an abstraction, a common measure that allowed 100 different goods to be weighed against one another and written into a single, coherent ledger. And it should not be imagined as a European idea imposed on people who had none. Indigenous trade networks had their own units of account and their own pricing conventions long before any of this. The made beaver was simply this particular company's formalization of a principle already old on that land, and it governed its books for the better part of 200 years. Life inside the palisade was not comfortable, but it was not the bare desperation the climate might suggest. The annual ship brought out real quantities of provisions: flour, salt beef, salt pork, dried peas, butter, chocolate, tea, and the occasional small luxury tucked in among the trade goods. These were supplemented by whatever the country gave, geese and duck and ptarmigan in their seasons, fish out of the haze, caribou and moose brought in by the indigenous families who lived and worked around the post, and by the men themselves. The food was monotonous. The isolation was total. For 11 months of the year, the supply ship was the only thread connecting that place to the rest of the world, and a letter written to London in September could not be answered before the following summer at the earliest. Men who stayed for several seasons developed exactly the adaptations that institutional psychiatry would later catalogue in polar stations and remote communities everywhere. Small disagreements swelling into permanent feuds, routines hardening into private ceremony, and an intense, almost devotional attention to the smallest changes in the natural world. The first crocus pushing through old snow, the first skein of geese overhead in spring, heard before it was seen. In a place where one week is indistinguishable from the next, these things become the calendar. Men wrote them down. They are still in the journals, in careful ink, and the dates of those first geese are now used by scientists to reconstruct 3 centuries of Arctic climate, a use their authors could not have imagined and would probably have found very funny. The rivals who finally broke that 100-year sleep were not foreigners. They were fellow British subjects, and most of them were Scots. They were the merchants of Montreal, many of them Highlanders who had come to Canada in the wake of the British conquest of New France in 1759, and who had inherited, along with the colonial infrastructure, the accumulated French knowledge of the interior. The loose partnerships and syndicates among them hardened by the early 1780s into the Northwest Company. They were building directly on the legacy of the coureurs de bois, the woods runners whose command of the river systems had kept New France commercially alive for a century. They spoke French at work. They travelled by birch-bark canoe. They hired French-Canadian voyageurs as their labour, and, this was the whole of it, they went to where the fur was, rather than waiting for the fur to come to them. The voyageurs who paddled those brigades are among the most physically astonishing workers in the history of North American labour, and it is worth slowing down here, because the material reality of how a beaver pelt actually travelled from a frozen creek in the interior to a hat shop in London is one of the great logistical achievements of the pre-industrial world. They were French-Canadian men, many of them short and compactly built, a physique the work rewarded, since long legs were only in the way in a loaded canoe. They paddled 10 to 18 hours a day in season, holding a stroke rate somewhere between 40 and 60 a minute, hour after hour, from 3 in the morning until 9 at night. Where the water became impossible, they carried everything past it. The canoe itself, and the bales, and the provisions. The canoe was an indigenous technology so precisely adapted to the rivers and lakes of the Canadian Shield that European boat building of the period had nothing whatever to offer in its place. The great canot du Maître, used on the main highway between Montreal and the interior, ran to about 12 metres, could carry 4 tons, and was still light enough that a crew of 8 or 10 could lift the whole vessel onto their shoulders and walk it over rock. Birch bark, cedar, spruce root and pine gum, repairable anywhere along a river with materials growing on the bank. It is difficult to overstate how good a piece of design that is. The portage was the fundamental test. Every carrying place between one water and the next, some of them a few minutes' walk, some of them hours of rough climbing through granite and muskeg. The standard load was 2 90-pound bales, taken on the back and held by a leather tumpline across the forehead, a way of distributing weight through the spine that allowed enormous loads to be carried over broken ground with a speed and stability that no backpack has ever quite equalled. A man who could take 3 bales, 270 pounds, over a hard portage was regarded as exceptional, and everyone in the brigade knew his name. The hierarchy of strength and endurance in that world was as clearly ranked and as socially serious as any commission in an army. And they sang. The chansons that kept the paddle stroke at 40 to 60 beats a minute were the metronome of the working day, and they are one of the few pieces of fur trade material culture that survived in a form we can still reach. Hundreds of them were collected in the 1800s, words and melodies written down just before the world that made them disappeared. They run from the broadly comic to the tender, to the genuinely beautiful, And inside them is the specific texture of a life organized around water and portage and season in a way no ledger or report preserves. A man who paddled from Montreal to Lake Athabasca and back inside a single season covered something near 6,000 kilometres. That requires an extraordinary body. It also requires a particular adaptation of the mind to months of continuous motion, discomfort and risk. And the songs, one suspects, were at least half of how that adaptation was maintained. The company would eventually run something even more spectacular. The York Factory Express, in its prime in the 1830s and 40s, connected York Factory on Hudson Bay with the Pacific coast posts of the Columbia Department. Roughly 6,700 kilometres, run annually from spring through fall, carrying mail, financial dispatches, new employees heading west, and retiring employees heading home. River travel, portage, mountain crossing, all of it timed against the closing of the Rocky Mountain passes with snow. The men who ran it averaged something like 40 kilometres a day, across terrain that included nearly every condition the continent could produce, from the glacial lakes of the Shield to the passes of the Rockies to the great rivers of the Columbia watershed. It was discontinued after 1846, when a line drawn on a map made Fort Vancouver American soil, and the western half of the route no longer led anywhere British. Its ending was one of the clearest markers of the company's long retreat from its continental peak. The Northwest Company's reach in those decades was simply astonishing. Alexander Mackenzie followed the river that now bears his name to the Arctic Ocean in 1789 and was so disappointed to find salt water at the top of the world rather than the Pacific that he is said to have called it the River of Disappointment. 4 years later, he crossed the Rocky Mountains and reached the Pacific coast, the first European to cross the continent north of Mexico, and painted a short sentence on a rock in a mixture of vermilion and bear grease to say so. David Thompson mapped the whole Columbia system with a surveyor's patience and an accuracy that startled everyone who checked his work afterward. Simon Fraser went down the river that carries his name to the sea, through a canyon that very nearly killed his entire party. The Nor'westers mapped the interior of North America to a degree the older company, dozing on its shoreline, could not begin to match. And the competition between the two was not confined to price lists. By the early 1800s, it had become a guerrilla war fought across thousands of miles of wilderness, and the thing it was fought over was not fur at all. It was pemmican. Dried buffalo meat, pounded fine, mixed with rendered fat and often with dried berries, pressed into cakes and packed into rawhide bags. Nutritionally dense, indefinitely stable in cold, portable and producible in real quantity during the great buffalo hunts that the métis of the Red River conducted twice a year with a discipline and organization that impressed every outsider who saw it. Pemmican was the fuel of the entire Western trade. The Nor'westers' interior network ran on it absolutely. Without the métis-supplied depots feeding the canoe brigades and the wintering posts, the whole logistical system would have simply stopped moving. The older company understood this, and when it acquired rights in the Red River country and established a farming colony there, it found itself, whether by design or by accident, holding its rival's supply line in its hand. In 1814, the governor of that colony issued what became known as the Pemmican Proclamation, forbidding the export of pemmican and other provisions out of the settlement. From one angle, it was a reasonable emergency measure by a struggling colony trying to make sure it could feed itself through the winter. From the angle of the Northwest Company and of the Métis hunters who supplied it, it was an attack on a livelihood and a naked assertion of authority over country the Nor'westers had effectively been administering for decades, and the Métis regarded as home. But to understand what was truly at stake, you have to understand the colony itself. Because Red River was never merely a convenient outpost, it was an attempted civilization. And it was the creation of one of the most idealistic and most practically catastrophic men in the company's long history. Thomas Douglas, 5th Earl of Selkirk, was a Scottish nobleman who had spent his adult life watching the Highland clearances with something close to horror. Watching crofting families evicted from ground their people had worked for generations, to make room for sheep that paid the landlords better. He was genuinely moved by that suffering. He was genuinely idealistic about the possibility of building new communities for the displaced, somewhere across the Atlantic. And he was genuinely wealthy enough to act on both. So he bought a substantial share in the Hudson's Bay Company for the specific purpose of obtaining a land grant. And he obtained one, some 16,000 square miles of the Red River Valley and the country around it, an area 5 times the size of Scotland. By the terms of the charter, it was the company's to give. Whether it was wise or decent to plant an agricultural colony in the middle of a territory that the North West Company regarded as the artery of its supply, that the Métis regarded as their homeland, and that indigenous peoples had occupied for thousands of years, these questions either never occurred to Selkirk or seemed to him manageable. Idealists are frequently poor at asking who is already standing on the ground. The first settlers reached the Red River in 1812, and the journey alone was a demonstration of everything that would go wrong. An Atlantic crossing, then a passage into Hudson Bay, then hundreds of miles overland, arriving far too late in the year to plant anything. They survived that first winter only on emergency provisions from the company, and several did not survive it at all. And yet, what eventually took root on the banks of the Red and the Assiniboine, on the exact ground where the towers of Winnipeg stand tonight, was both far more modest than Selkirk had imagined, and far more remarkable than his critics ever allowed. The settlers, Scots and Irish and French Canadian, learned from the Métis how to put a crop in northern ground and get it out again before the frost. How to read the spring flood of the Red, which can erase a season's work in 3 days. How to hunt buffalo out on the plains to the west. They adopted the Métis system of land tenure, long, narrow river lots running back from the water's edge, so that every family had frontage on the river and the greatest possible number of farms could sit along it. It is a pattern you can still see from the air over parts of Manitoba, drawn into the fields like a signature. They built churches, they organised schools, they began the slow, ordinary work of civic life. By the 1820s and 30s, Red River was a real community of several thousand people, mixed in its origins, precarious in its economics, and entirely distinctive in its blend of Indigenous, Métis, French-Canadian, Scottish and English elements. Nothing quite like it existed anywhere else on the continent. The conflict over pemmican escalated across 2 years and a series of increasingly ugly incidents, forts seized, property burned, armed men confronting one another on open prairie, and it came to a head on the 19th of June, 1816, at a stand of trees called 7 Oaks. By any military measure it was nothing, perhaps 60 men on each side, perhaps 15 minutes from first word to last shot. Its consequences were entirely out of proportion to its size. A party of Métis horsemen under Cuthbert Grant intercepted a group of company men led by Robert Semple, the governor of the colony. Words were exchanged. Someone reached for a weapon. When the smoke drifted off the grass, Semple and 20 of his men were dead, and 1 Métis man had been killed. The Métis who rode away from that field understood it as a decisive assertion of their right to their own country, and they said so immediately and in song. Pierre Falcon, the settlement's bard, composed a ballad about it within days, a song still sung, which celebrates the day not as a commercial skirmish, but as the founding moment of a people's political identity. That is a striking thing. A nation announcing itself in verse, on the afternoon of the event, in a language braided out of 2 others. London took notice, mostly because the prospect of sustained private warfare in the interior alarmed a government with quite enough wars already. Parliamentary pressure on both companies produced a forced marriage in 1821. The combined enterprise kept the older name. The Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the North West Company, and with it the whole chain of interior posts reaching to the Pacific. The merger changed everything at once. It gave the old company the thing it had never possessed, direct access to the interior, a network already built and staffed and provisioned. It gave the Nor'westers wintering partners, many of them exceptionally capable men with decades of country knowledge, a future inside the combined organization rather than a ruin outside it. And it cleared the ground for a new kind of management, embodied almost immediately in the most powerful individual the company ever produced. George Simpson arrived in North America in 1820, sent out by the London Committee as a spare part. He was to stand ready to replace the company's existing North American governor, should that man be arrested by the Northwest Company, which in the temperature of that year was a perfectly realistic concern. He was a small red-haired Scot of about 30, born in the north of Scotland to unmarried parents of different social stations, educated in mathematics, and trained in London as a clerk in the sugar trade. He had never been in the subarctic. He had never paddled a canoe, never wintered at a post, never sat across a fire from a chief, never organised a brigade. By every ordinary measure of fitness for the position he was about to occupy, he was entirely unqualified. He became, by a considerable margin, the most effective administrator the North American fur trade ever had. What Simpson possessed was a combination that his predecessors had rarely managed to hold together. He could read numbers, and he could travel. He looked at a set of trade figures and saw waste that men who had been running the operation for 20 years had apparently stopped noticing. And he was not content to manage from paper. He wanted to see it, all of it, on the ground, and he was willing, eager even, to cover the distances that required. His journeys became legend. Canoe in summer, dog sled in winter, at a pace that would have been punishing for a younger and fitter man, and he kept it up for decades. He also understood theatre. He would arrive at a remote post with a bugle blast as his canoe came round the last bend, a piper standing in the bow with the bagpipes going, the crew in matched paddling and dead silence otherwise, the whole apparition sweeping into view out of an empty river. The message to men who had not seen a stranger in 8 months was unmistakable. You are not forgotten, and the standards applied at York Factory are applied here. The rationalisation that followed the merger was ruthless in its logic and in its execution. He closed the duplicate posts where the two companies had spent years glaring at each other across 100 yards of water. He cut the workforce that competitive years had swollen to a size the new monopoly did not need. He standardised practice across a network that now spanned a continent. And, east of the Rockies, he replaced the canoe brigades with the York boat, a heavier, sturdier, far less beautiful vessel derived from the fishing boats of Orkney, which the Orcadian employees already knew how to build and sail. The canoe was faster and could go places the York boat never could. The York boat carried more cargo with fewer skilled hands. Simpson was not sentimental about beauty. He was after efficiency, and he got it. Then he turned west. The Columbia District, everything draining to the Pacific through the Columbia River, taking in what are now Oregon and Washington and parts of Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia, had been run by the Northwest Company with a lordly disregard for expense that Simpson found genuinely offensive when he opened the books. He made his first inspection in 1824, crossing overland from Hudson Bay to Fort George at the river's mouth, over the Rockies and down rivers he had never seen, at a pace that suggests he was racing his own growing reputation and enjoying it. What he found at Fort George displeased him thoroughly. Too large, too costly, too devoted to maintaining a gentleman's style of life for the senior officers at the expense of the returns. He ordered it stripped back, and he ordered a new headquarters built further up the river at a site he chose himself, Fort Vancouver, on the north bank near the mouth of the Willamette, which became the commercial and administrative capital of the entire Pacific Northwest for the next 20 years. His strategy for that coast included one element of real and rather cold-blooded sophistication. The boundary between British and American claims in the Oregon country had not been settled. The region lay under joint occupation by agreement, its eventual ownership open. Simpson understood that the Americans, already beginning to push through the mountains in growing numbers, would eventually press their claim, if the country south of the Columbia proved worth claiming. So he set out to make it not worth claiming. He would trap it bare. Every year he sent the Snake Country Brigades, mixed parties of company men, indigenous hunters, and Iroquois trappers who had come west with the trade, into the Snake River drainage with explicit orders to take every beaver they could find and leave nothing behind that could sustain a commercial trade for anyone else. A deliberate fur desert. If you cannot keep your rival out of the house, you can at least make sure he arrives to an empty larder. It was an environmental catastrophe and, on its own narrow terms, a success. The beaver of the Snake Country were effectively wiped out within a generation. The American mountain men who came over the passes in real numbers found the southern approaches already stripped. And it did not work at all, because Simpson had solved the wrong problem. The Willamette Valley, south of the Columbia, was not fur country. It was farming country, the richest soil and gentlest climate on the whole Pacific coast, and the Americans who began rolling in along the Oregon Trail in the early 1840s had not come for beaver. They had come for land. The company could manufacture a fur desert. It could not manufacture an agricultural one, and the farms filling that valley became the foundation of an American claim that no amount of strategic trapping could touch. John McLaughlin, the chief factor who actually ran Fort Vancouver day to day beneath Simpson's distant and exacting supervision, was simultaneously one of Simpson's most effective officers and one of his most persistent irritations. He was a very large man, 6'4", with hair that had gone white early, giving him a patriarchal presence that his employees found commanding and his indigenous trading partners found impressive. He was known up and down the river as the white-headed eagle, and he had a humanitarian instinct that collided again and again with the commercial discipline Simpson was trying to impose. When American settlers reached Fort Vancouver at the end of the overland journey, sick, starving, destitute, having buried people along the way, McLaughlin fed them. He housed them. He gave them medical care and seed and credit to begin again, and he did it knowing precisely what Simpson would say. Simpson regarded it as commercially reckless and strategically suicidal. Every American family McLaughlin set on its feet was another nail in the coffin of the British claim to Oregon. McLaughlin regarded it as the only thing a decent person could do when hungry people arrive at your gate. Both of them were right. That is the difficulty. The tension between those two positions could not be resolved inside the framework either man was working in, and it eventually cost McLaughlin his place in the company he had served for decades. The Oregon Boundary Settlement of 1846 drew the line at the 49th parallel, the same latitude that had divided the two claims east of the Rockies since 1818, and simply carried it through to the sea. Everything south went to the United States, including the Willamette Valley and Fort Vancouver itself. Everything north remained British, including the future province of British Columbia. The company wound down its operations below the line over the following decade. McLaughlin retired to Oregon City and became an American citizen, and is remembered there now as a founder, which is not what London had in mind. The enterprise that had effectively governed the Pacific Northwest for 20 years was pushed back above the 49th. What remained was still an enormous country, larger than any nation in Europe, but it was a real contraction from the continental reach the merged company had briefly held, and everyone involved understood it as one. Now, before the last act, we need to sit for a while with the harder part of this story, and to do it carefully, because there are two familiar versions of it, and both are wrong. In one version, indigenous peoples were simply robbed, handed worthless trinkets in exchange for immensely valuable furs by traders who despised them. In the other, the exchange was fair and mutual, two commercial traditions meeting as equals. Neither survives contact with the records. The goods the company offered were genuinely valuable, and not in the condescending colonial fable of simple people dazzled by shiny objects. They were valuable because they did real work better than the alternatives. An iron knife took a keener edge and held it far longer than stone. A woolen blanket stayed warm when it was wet, which matters more than almost anything else in that climate. A copper kettle was lighter than clay, did not break when a dog knocked it over, and could be set directly in the coals. A gun extended the reach of a hunter and altered decisively the balance between a people who had them and a people who did not. And the bargaining at the counter was hard bargaining. Indigenous traders negotiated with a sophistication that European commentators repeatedly recorded with surprise, played competing posts against one another when they could, and were entirely capable of walking away. The cost was not really in the exchange rate, it was in the structure. It lay in being drawn into a global commercial system whose terms were set in London and Paris rather than on the shore of the bay. The trade created dependencies on manufactured goods, on rations issued from the post, and above all on the relationship itself, since hunting with a European firearm requires a European supply of powder and shot. Communities that had built their economies around that relationship across generations discovered when the trade shifted, when beaver grew scarce, when fashion moved on, when a governor in a canoe decided to close their post as a redundancy, that the adjustment was devastating in ways nobody had planned for and nobody had designed a remedy against. The company's earliest factors could see from direct observation that the trade was producing changes that were not simply beneficial. Competition for access to goods, and above all to firearms, drove patterns of warfare and displacement that the company did not create, but that its presence steadily intensified. The Cree expansion westward across the prairies through the 17 and 1800s, a people moving out from their original country around the bay onto the buffalo plains of what is now Saskatchewan and Manitoba, was driven partly by the advantage of proximity to the posts, and partly by the military edge that early access to guns conferred over peoples further away. The displacement of the Assiniboine, the Blackfoot, and others from country they had long held was connected, causally if not simply, to the uneven flow of goods along the company's commercial web. None of this was policy. The company's interests were served by stable, populous, commercially active partners. A community that has collapsed brings no furs to the counter. But the indirect consequences were catastrophic in ways that an annual accounting of fur returns was simply not built to perceive, still less to prevent. And then there is the thing that is hardest of all to hold in the mind at its true scale. The epidemic diseases of European civilization travelled the same roads as the trade goods. Smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, moving along the rivers and the portages and the winter trails, carried in the breath of people who did not know they were carrying anything. In populations with no prior exposure and no inherited immune memory, the mortality was of a kind that has no useful comparison in European experience. Individual outbreaks reduced particular communities by 50%, by 70%, in some places by 90%, within a single season. The great smallpox epidemic of 1780 to 1782 crossed the western plains and the subarctic in a wave that the company's own journals, the records of the Nor'westers, and the oral traditions of a dozen indigenous nations all independently describe. By any measure, it is among the greatest demographic catastrophes in the history of North America. Its reach ran from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic coast, following exactly the networks of travel and exchange that had connected the continent for millennia, with a relentlessness that no institution of that era could have tracked, let alone interrupted. The company's trade returns for the years immediately afterward show the commercial shape of it with a terrible plainness. The furs stopped coming, not because the animals had gone, because the people who trapped them and carried them down the rivers were dead. The demographic collapse of the subarctic and plains populations across those centuries was not one event. It was wave after wave, each one arriving before the survivors of the last had rebuilt, so that recovery never had the years it needed. The trade did not cause this deliberately. There was no interest, commercial or otherwise, in the death of the people the entire enterprise depended upon. But the commercial network was the vector. The same canoes carried both. And the company's failure to reckon with that reality while the trade was at its height, its capacity to record an epidemic in a journal, provide some food to families too sick to hunt, and then rule a line and total the season's returns, is among the most uncomfortable dimensions of its long history. In fairness, nobody in that century understood disease transmission well enough to have acted differently. In fairness also, that is an explanation and not an absolution. Out of the specific social world of the trade, meanwhile, a new people had come into being. The Métis were born of the unions between European traders and indigenous women, relationships that were, in that world, not incidental but structural, since a trader without kinship ties had no standing, no interpreter, no access, and no one to make his snowshoes or dry his meat or tell him what the country was about to do. The children of those unions grew up fluent in two worlds and belonging fully to a third. They spoke indigenous languages and French or English. They possessed the physical and logistical arts of the trade from childhood. They held kinship in indigenous communities that made them irreplaceable intermediaries, and they were educated in European commerce and religion through the missions that followed the posts. By the early 1800s, they were no longer simply the mixed descent children of individual marriages. They were a people. They had their own language, Michif, an extraordinary fusion that takes its verbs from Cree and its nouns from French, a structure so unusual that linguists still study it as a near-unique case. They had their own institutions, their own laws of the buffalo hunt, their own music and dress and sash and fiddle, their own homeland along the Red and the Assiniboine, and a clear and growing sense of themselves as a nation with collective interests. When the company sold Rupert's land to the government of Canada in 1869, the Métis of Red River were not consulted. They were not mentioned. The land they had farmed for generations in their long river lots passed from one set of distant governors, shareholders in London, to another set of distant governors in Ottawa, with no acknowledgement anywhere in the documents that the people actually living on it might have a view. The surveyors arrived that autumn to divide the country into the square township grid the Canadian government preferred for settlement. They came without warning, without consultation, and without the slightest recognition that a system of land tenure already existed there and had organised the settlement for decades. Louis Riel was 24 years old in 1869. Métis, educated in Montreal, fluent in French and English and Michif, and possessed of a political intelligence and a personal magnetism that made him the obvious leader of the resistance his community assembled almost overnight. On the 11th of October, a group of Métis men, Riel among them, walked out to where the surveyors were working and stopped them, physically, by standing on the survey chain and declining to let it move any further across their land. It was deliberate, and it was theatrical, and it was completely effective. A foot on a chain, nothing more required. Within weeks, the Métis had organised a provisional government, taken Upper Fort Garry, the company's principal post in the region, which housed the whole apparatus of local administration, and opened negotiations with Ottawa over the terms on which Red River would enter Confederation. Those negotiations produced the Manitoba Act of 1870. It admitted the region as a province. It guaranteed official standing for the French language alongside English. It protected the existing land rights of existing settlers, and, in one of its most significant provisions, it reserved 1,400,000 acres for the children of Métis families in recognition of their particular connection to that country. The list of rights Riel's government had put before Ottawa was, if not entirely met, very substantially met. By the standards of colonial encounters anywhere in the 19th century, that is a remarkable outcome. A community that had been overlooked entirely in a transaction covering a third of a continent had organised itself in a matter of weeks, negotiated from a position of genuine strength, and extracted binding protections from a government that had fully intended simply to absorb it. The tragedy is what happened next, and it happened slowly, which is the way most tragedies of that kind happen. The land grant to Métis children was administered incompetently and in places corruptly. It arrived late in the form of paper certificates called scrip into communities under enormous pressure, and speculators bought those certificates for a fraction of their face value from families who could not wait years for a survey. Meanwhile, settlers poured in from Ontario, drawn by exactly the agricultural promise that had made the valley valuable in the first place. And inside a decade, the Métis were a minority in the province they had just created. Riel himself was driven into exile after the execution of Thomas Scott, an Ontario Protestant who had repeatedly and violently defied the provisional government's authority and who was court-martialed and shot. That decision made Riel a hero in French Catholic Quebec and a murderer in English Protestant Ontario, and it split Canadian opinion along a seam that made any political future for him impossible. He came back 15 years later, in 1885, to lead a second resistance in the Saskatchewan country, where many Métis families had gone after losing their Manitoba land. This time, the arithmetic was different. The Canadian Pacific Railway had reached the prairies, and troops that would once have taken months to arrive could now be moved west in days. What had been sufficient force in 1870 was overwhelmed. Riel was captured, tried for high treason, and hanged at Regina in November of 1885. His execution set into the foundations of Canadian politics a fault line that had opened at Red River and that has never entirely closed. He has since been called a traitor, a martyr, a madman, a prophet, and a father of Confederation, sometimes by the same institution in different decades. Historians are still arguing about him tonight. The sale of 1869 marks the beginning of the company's long change from a territorial power into something else entirely. But before we follow it into its final incarnation, it is worth asking a question that usually gets skipped. What, exactly, had the company been governing all that time? Because it was neither an ordinary business nor a conventional colony. It was something genuinely new, for which the available words were not adequate then and are not now. On paper, the authority was total. Laws, courts, executive power over every person within the territory, all of it granted in 1670 and confirmed by later legislation. In practice, that authority was exercised at the posts and in a modest circle around them, and essentially nowhere else. The overwhelming bulk of Rupert's land, the country between the posts, the hunting grounds, the winter camps, the plains and the forests and the tundra, which is to say almost all of it, was governed by the people who lived there, according to their own laws and their own long custom, with the trading relationship as the only real point of contact with the company that claimed it. A factor might sentence a man for theft inside the palisade. 4 miles upriver, his writ meant nothing at all, and everyone understood that, including him. The Council of Assiniboia, which administered the Red River settlement from 1835 onward, was the closest thing Rupert's land ever had to a working colonial government. Its members were appointed rather than elected, but they included representatives of the settlement's main population groups, Métis members sitting alongside English and Scottish settlers and company officers, and its records showed genuine deliberation about local conditions and local needs, rather than the simple relay of instructions from elsewhere. By the standards of a small mid-century jurisdiction, it functioned reasonably well. But it was a government for one settlement. It was never a government for the enormous country beyond, and it could not have been. The people, the money, and the will to build such a thing did not exist. So when the Canadian government bought Rupert's land, this is what it actually bought. Not an administered territory with a working apparatus waiting to be inherited, but a commercial claim over an immensity that had never been governed by the seller in any meaningful sense, and that had been incorporated into a distant metropolitan system only at the particular points where a trading post stood. The transfer did not hand over an existing colonial state. It created a brand new governmental claim over ground the previous claimant had never truly held, which is precisely why the problem that followed, how to administer and develop that country in fact, rather than on paper, proved so much harder and so much costlier than the purchase price had ever suggested. The first retail store opened in Winnipeg in 1881. A general merchandise establishment aimed squarely at the settlers arriving in numbers along the new railway lines that Confederation was laying west with deliberate purpose. In one sense, nothing had changed. The trading post had always been a place where you could obtain everything a life in that country required, from flour and tobacco to axes and cloth. But the customer was now a different person. The indigenous and Métis traders who had been the company's partners for 2 centuries were being displaced, and the newcomers arrived with different habits and different expectations, and the company's model bent itself to serve the new demographic rather than the old. The point blanket came through that transition intact, and it is the one object that ties the whole 355 years together in a single piece of cloth. It had been developed as a trade good for exactly the post counter we have been standing at all evening, heavy wool, produced in standard weights and sizes since the early 1700s, the short black points woven into the selvage to declare its size without a word being spoken. The stripes came later and settled over time, cream ground with bands of green and red and yellow and indigo, standardized in the 1800s, and eventually so completely identified with the company and with the country that it became a kind of flag you could sleep under. It is still made today, same design, same weights, same 4 colors in the same order. By the middle of the 20th century, the Hudson Bay Company had become one of the dominant retail chains in Canada, a department store with a Latin motto about skin and a coat of arms with 4 beavers on it, selling perfume and winter coats in city centres. But the 50 years between the transfer of Rupert's land and the full establishment of that retail identity deserve their own attention, because that is when the transformation actually happened, and it was neither smooth nor entirely successful. The company entered the 1870s genuinely uncertain about what it now was. The fur trade, which had been the whole foundation for 200 years, was declining, but not dead. The beaver hat was finished, yet other furs remained in demand, and the Hudson Bay Basin still held otter and marten and mink and fox in commercially meaningful numbers, even at a fraction of the old abundance. So the company kept its posts through the late 19th century, shifting them gradually toward general provisioning for the settlers flowing west along the rails. It was also, by then, one of the largest landowners in Canada. The terms of the transfer had reserved some 7 million acres of fertile prairie for the company's own account, and the disposal of that land, sold off in parcels through the decades as the railway made the prairie reachable and farmland valuable, became one of its principal financial activities and one of its most successful. Ground that had been effectively worthless when the deal was struck became immensely valuable once settlement arrived, and the steady sale of it from the 1880s into the 1930s funded the whole transition into retail. The company sold a continent, kept the best 7 million acres of it, and lived off that decision for 50 years. Its role in the westward extension of the Canadian state was never merely commercial. The infrastructure of posts and routes and relationships was the foundation on which Ottawa's Western administration was built. The numbered treaties negotiated with Indigenous peoples of the Prairie and subarctic between 1871 and 1921 were conducted, in many cases, at or near company posts, with company factors serving as interpreters, as witnesses, or as informal advisors to one side or both. 2 centuries of commercial relationship had produced knowledge the government needed and could not otherwise obtain, and the passing of that knowledge, sometimes explicit, more often simply ambient, is one of the ways the company's history was stitched permanently into the countries. Those stitches are being examined in courtrooms to this day. There is one more episode to place before the ending, and it happened at the edge of the company's world rather than at its centre. But for a decade in the middle of the 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company was the nearest thing to an institutional witness to the most famous disappearance of the age. Sir John Franklin sailed from England in 1845 with 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and 128 men on what was meant to be the final expedition, the one that would at last complete the mapping of the Northwest Passage and close the question that had been open for 300 years. Franklin was 60 and had a long naval career behind him. The ships were the most advanced vessels ever sent into the Arctic. Steam engines with screw propellers that could be lifted clear of the ice, hulls reinforced along the bow, 3 years of provisions in the hold, a library, an organ. Nothing came back. Not a ship, not a man. They were caught in the ice off King William Island in 1846 and never got free. Franklin died in June of 1847. The survivors abandoned the ships in April of 1848 and set out to walk south across the barren lands toward a river mouth and a post that were farther away than anyone still standing could reach. None of them arrived. More than 40 expeditions went looking for them across the following decade, a search that did more to lodge the Arctic in the public imagination than any voyage of discovery ever had. The company was involved in several of them, not as an organizer, but as the infrastructure that made searching possible at all. Its posts became supply depots, its men served as guides and interpreters, its canoes and its knowledge of the country underwrote parties who would otherwise have had no way to move. And the truth, when it finally came first from people who had been telling it all along. Inuit witnesses who had encountered the last of the survivors described what they had seen to investigators with a precision that was initially dismissed as unreliable, then reluctantly reconsidered as physical evidence accumulated, and is now recognized as the single most accurate account anyone ever gave. The wrecks themselves were found in 2014 and 2016, resting on the seabed within a short distance of where Inuit testimony had always placed them. The whole story is one of the great narratives of the 19th century, and the company sits quietly at its edges as the organization that made continuous human presence in that country possible in the first place. Because that is what it was, in the end. Not simply a store, not even simply a monopoly in fur. For 200 years it was a kind of government, imperfect, self-interested, extractive, occasionally brutal, and also, in its particular time and place, genuinely constitutive of the institutions and relationships out of which the Canadian West was assembled as a human community. The posts became towns, and the towns became cities. The river routes the brigades paddled became the roads and the rail lines. The treaties negotiated in their shadow became the legal foundation of indigenous relationships with the Crown. The people the trade brought into being became a nation, and the land the company sold in 1869 became Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. It took 20 years, and it was mostly made of ordinary decisions. Online commerce changed the structural economics of physical retail in a way that dissolved every advantage the great downtown department store had relied upon for a century. The convenience of buying everything in one building, the breadth of stock under a single roof, the brand that drew a customer through the doors before she knew what she wanted, all of it thinned to almost nothing once the same customer could see 100 times the inventory on a screen, compare every price in seconds, and have the box arrive at her door without her leaving the house. The ownership story added its own weight. The company was taken private in 2006 by a consortium including an American private equity firm, and the years that followed brought a run of acquisitions. The Lord & Taylor chain in the United States, the German department store group Galeria Kaufhof, a partnership with the Saks Fifth Avenue brand. Each expanded the footprint, each expanded the debt, each divided management attention across more brands and more markets. The European holdings were sold off by 2019, having lost money. Lord and Taylor went bankrupt in 2020. The Sachs arrangement generated complications of its own. Every pivot left the company more encumbered and less focused than the one before. When the filing came in March of 2025, the debts ran past $1.1 billion, owed to landlords who had gone unpaid, to suppliers who had gone unpaid, to tax authorities owed years of arrears. The buildings themselves had been quietly falling apart. Deferred maintenance had left flagship stores in several cities in a condition visible to any customer who looked up, and landlords had already begun sketching plans for other tenants before the announcement was made. No buyer could be found for the retail operations. By April, the remaining stores were liquidating. By June, the last of them had closed. By July, 355 years of institutional life had ended. Canadian Tire acquired the intellectual property, the name, the coat of arms, the right to the 4 stripes. Whether those will one day be used to raise something new under the old colours, or whether they will simply rest in a portfolio as a legacy holding, had not been decided at the time this was written. The night has come all the way down around you now, and the long story of the Hudson Bay Company has reached the end that we are able to give it, which is the end of the stores and the liquidation and the empty windows. It is not the end of the history. That continues in the land claims and the treaty negotiations and the archaeological sites and in the oral traditions of peoples who were here long before the company and who are here still long after it. The beaver the trade very nearly erased is back in the rivers of the subarctic, patient and industrious, rebuilding its ponds in country where no one is counting pelts anymore. The posts are mostly ruins. York Factory was abandoned in 1957, and its great wooden buildings are settling slowly into the permafrost that held them up for 3 centuries, tilting a little more each year. A national historic site kept at minimal expense and reachable only by floatplane or by boat. The boardwalks are gone. The geese still come over in spring, on almost exactly the dates the factors wrote down. The blankets are still being woven somewhere, in the same 4 colours, under whatever arrangement now governs the name. And it began with 2 Frenchmen in trouble with the authorities, carrying an idea about which way the rivers ran. With a prince who understood them, and a king who signed his name on a spring morning, and a small, tired ship called the Nonsuch that sailed into the top of the world in 1668 and came home with enough fur to keep a generation of London investors interested. It ran on through the wars with France and the treaty that ended them, through the rivalry with Montreal and the violence that ended that, through Simpson's brilliant and unlovely empire of ledgers, through the sale of Rupert's land and the foot on the survey chain and the scaffold at Regina, through the shift into shop fronts and the long, slow decline and the courtroom. The beaver hat went out of fashion in the 1840s. The institution that fashion had summoned into existence outlasted it by nearly 200 years. That is worth holding for a moment before you let it go. A company created to serve a passing taste in headwear survived that taste by generations, reinventing itself at every point where its original reason had quietly expired, until the last reinvention failed, and the long arithmetic finally came out even. If you had walked past one of those buildings in a Canadian city in the summer of last year, the structure still standing, the signage stripped or half-stripped, the windows papered over or already advertising someone new, you would have been walking past the material end of an institutional life that began on a cold shore in 1670. It had survived d'Iberville's guns in the ice. It had survived the Pemmican War and the loss of 1/3 of a continent and the collapse of the fur trade and 2 world wars. Let all of that settle now, gently, and let it go. The subarctic is dark tonight. The rivers are running under their ice toward Hudson Bay, carrying the drainage of half a continent down to a sea that has been receiving it since long before any person stood on those shores to watch. The water does not know about charters. It has simply been doing this, patiently, in the dark, for 10,000 years, and it will still be doing it tomorrow, and the year after, and long after every name in this story has softened into something people half remember. The buildings at York Factory lean a little further into the frozen ground. Somewhere in a warehouse, the blankets are folded in their stacks, cream and green and red and yellow and indigo, waiting. And in Winnipeg, in the quiet of a closed museum, there is a ship. Not the original, a replica of the Nonsuch, built for the company's 300th anniversary in 1970, which crossed the Atlantic under sail and came back again, and now rests indoors where no weather can reach it. 50 feet long, smaller than you would ever expect. Small enough that you can stand at her bow and take in the whole of her in a single glance, and find it difficult to believe that something this size went north into the ice with a handful of men aboard and altered the history of a continent. She is not going anywhere tonight. Neither are you. Rest easy.